My name is Ella Whelan. I'm the co-convener of this Battle of Ideas festival, and very excited to be chairing this final session, The War Against the Past, Looking to the Future, which is inspired by this book, The War Against the Past, a fantastic new book by Professor Frank Furedi, who I'll introduce in a second. The subtitle is Why the West Must Fight for Its History. Frank and I did a discussion about his book at Living Freedom, which is a really excellent sort of summer school university in 2.5 days for 18 to 30-year-olds, where he sort of introduced the ideas behind the war against the past and talked about the fact that from any sort of perspective in relation to whether it's the decolonisation movement, trends, cancel culture, what's going on in the arts world with sort of iconoclasm in portrait galleries and all the sort of culture war moments can in one way or another be traced back to a problem with our history, a problem with our past. The idea that everything that came before us was somehow inherently bad, and in order to make some kind of good future, you have to denounce the past. And this is what Frank has had an insight around in terms of being able to draw those trends together and ask the question of why it is we've got such a big problem with history, and what effect that has on our ability to form a future, but also our ability to communicate a sense of the present to young people in particular without being able to understand our past. So we're going to have a lecture from Frank, a little mini lecture, introduction, and then we're going to have 2 respondents. So I'll just introduce them. So to say something about Frank, those of you who've been to the Battle of Ideas before will know him very well. He's a long-standing friend of the Academy of Ideas and the Battle of Ideas Festival. Frank's a sociologist and a social commentator. Indeed, he's an author of, we wouldn't get to the end of this session if I listed all of his books, but on all the kind of big cultural, political moments over the last 20 or more years Frank's written about. But more recently, he's the executive director of MCC Brussels, which is a really interesting organization working in Brussels, but also throughout Europe, looking at trying to challenge some of the trends that he raises in the book, some of the sort of more pernicious cancel culture, but also anti-intellectual, anti-Western civilization forces and ideas in society. And the author of this great book, so we're very thankful to have Frank introducing that for us. And then after Frank speaks, we're going to have 2 brilliant respondents. The first is Emma Webb, who sat next to me here. Emma is a writer, a broadcaster, and a presenter at GB News, and she's a fellow of New Culture Forum, which is a very truncated bio for someone who does a lot. Emma is someone who's been a speaker at the Battle of Ideas for several years now, and has been a public commentator around the issues of attacks on freedom, but also the sort of subtle attacks in the realm of culture and the arts, and how these things, these issues around our problem with history play out on an everyday basis for people in their relationships, in questions about family life, or sort of the more subtle ways in which this raises its head. So really delighted to have Emma. And then last but not least, sat next to Emma, we have Dr. James Orr, who is the Associate Professor of Philosophy of Religion at the University of Cambridge, which is, again, a terrible short bio for him. He's author of many books and also somebody who you will have seen on the television, heard on the radio, talking about these kinds of issues, and particularly in the realm of universities and education. Someone who's doing a lot of work to push back on, or at the very least, poke holes in and question the conformity around the idea of everything that we're talking about in terms of the sort of demonization of history and a demonization of Western civilization. So anyway, that's enough from me. Can we all please welcome Frank to the stage?
So, contrary to what Ella was saying, I'm not going to give you a lecture, not only because I'm in the middle of my graveyard shift, getting to that point in time, but also because I'm much more interested in what Emma and James has got to say about my book. You know what, when you write a book, you kind of finish the book and you say to yourself, well, what kind of reaction are you going to get? How are people going to respond to it? Are they going to pick up on my loose formulations, or are they going to basically say that there's something that's missing here? These are important questions that an author asks. Right? And you don't need to be a particularly insecure author to raise these kinds of issues, especially because I felt that when I wrote this book, I was treading on a relatively new area. Although there are many books that have written about history, and many of them touch upon the meaning of the past, there hasn't been very much work done on the way in which the past has acquired a very different meaning in the 21st century. And that's one of the issues that I really try to deal with, to try to explain that what we understand about the past doesn't bear very much relationship to the way, for example, that my parents or their grandparents understood what the past was all about. And to do that, what I tried to do was to explain that the meaning of the past is not at all self-evident. We use the word fairly casually, and very often we think it simply means a temporal area that precedes us. The past is something that's already completed, it has happened, and we kind of counterpose the past to the present or to the future. But actually, the past isn't just something that has already happened. We also have what's very important in all of our lives, even when we're not aware of it, which is a sense of the past. We all have a sense of the past, and that sense of the past touches upon all kinds of important questions. For example, when you think of yourself and your relationship to your parents, to your community, to your nation, are you touched by it? Are you inspired by it? Do you feel there's a kind of connection, a positive connection, an organic link that binds you to something that is simply bigger than yourself? Or do you regard the past as something that you're really determined to leave behind, as something that you want to flee from because it's got all kinds of negative connotations to it? Or do you, for example, feel that the past, your sense of the past, when you look back upon what happened to your ancestors, what your community achieved, accomplished, is a source of inspiration to you? Are you inspired by the fact that these people have made certain things happen, that you are really a product of a very interesting, exciting adventure? So we have these reactions about what happened before us individually, as members of a specific family, but we also have it collectively, as a community or as a nation. And one of the points that I'm really trying to argue is that in the contemporary era, the past and our sense of the past has become a target of constant vilification, of non-stop demonization, when in a sense the very meaning of the past, our sensibility about what occurred in the past, is being continually challenged to the point at which there is nothing, some people would argue, that is slightly, even remotely redeeming about what has happened to us. And specifically, in the British context, if you look at all the different attacks upon the past, you'll find that there seems to be a constant yearning to represent what occurred in British history as a history of shame, that literally every important episode in our society is shameful. So you imagined that the Magna Carta was a really good thing because of its promise of freedom, because it represented a certain step forward. No, 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 you're wrong. The Magna Carta was the bunch of robber barons getting together to find a new way of exploiting things. You think, for example, that the Industrial Revolution, the Victorian period, was remarkable for its technological achievements. It was remarkable for the scientific advance, for the way in which it developed the ideals of freedom and openness to new experience. No, 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 no. The 19th century was a century where Britain systematically destroyed the planet, where they created an environmental catastrophe that still hasn't been repaired to this day. And I could go on and on and on. And I know myself, because I love the past and I love history, that even the most exciting periods in my mind have been subjected to this continuous demonization. So one of my favorite eras is that of Athenian democracy, ancient Athens, when democracy kicks in and becomes sort of something very real. And when you look at the discussion on Athenian democracy, you'll find that every individual that is associated with it directly or indirectly is to a considerable extent pathologized. So Aristotle, who's in many respects one of the most important philosophers, the man who's developed a sense of ideas about virtues that to this day are important for guiding millions and millions of people, I now discovered that Aristotle turned out to be the father of white supremacy. Right? And when I look around and look at all the other people, you'll find that they too are represented in this. And not only that, when you look at democracy, I mean, where would we be if the Athenians at that particular stage in time did not have this idea that there is an important step forward in being democratic, that sense of the demos being really critical to their thinking. But today we discover that democracy and the Athenian experience was actually based upon slavery. And that because of the existence of slavery in ancient Athens, democracy and their ideals become negated, forgetting the very simple fact that every society in that era had slaves. But what distinguished Athens from all these other societies wasn't slavery, but that nevertheless, despite slavery, they still developed the idea of democracy. And it gets more and more absurd. The more I looked into this, I discovered that not only was Aristotle the father of white supremacy, but that Greek philosophy was actually stolen from the Africans. I don't know, they have a most fertile imagination in doing this, because it makes no sense how a philosopher of white supremacy would be born in Africa and would be, to some extent, linked to the African experience. But it goes on and on and on. And the point that I'm making is this, and this is something that people often misinterpret. There's absolutely nothing wrong with rewriting history. There's nothing wrong with revising history. We do that all the time. And it's very honorable for historians to point out that there are some big flaws in the way that I or anybody else have interpreted the past. That's entirely legitimate. What we're seeing today is not the revision of history. It's not a different interpretation of the past. It's not putting into the historical textbooks invisible individuals who weren't recognized in the past, but we now recognize them. What they're basically saying about the past is that we should basically negate it. We should cut ourselves off from the past, almost create this year zero ideology where you build a wall, a quarantine around the past, because you're suggesting that all the influence that emanates from the past is entirely toxic and contaminates the way we lead our life to the present. This has never happened before. If you take, for example, the Soviet Union and high Stalinism, they basically denounced everything about the bourgeois past. They criticized, these people were exploiters, slave owners, and everything else. But nevertheless, Lenin and all the other Marxists like Stalin had their heroes from the past. They would think that the Spartacus Rebellion was a really good thing, and that was their hero. They would think that French revolutionaries did something really, really great. So they basically found individuals that they would identify with. The attacks on the past today is very different. There are no heroes. there are no good stories, there are no positive episodes. There is simply a past that is a story of shame that contaminates our present. The way that I understand, the most simple way that I understand what has happened, is if we counterpose two ways of understanding the past. I think there is two diametrically opposed ways of understanding the past. One of the ways is the traditional one in the West, and not just in the West, but also in Asia. And it's best summed up by the Roman political theorist Cicero. And Cicero basically talked about the past as something that provides us with a lesson for life. As far as he was concerned, if we draw on the resources of the past, they teach us a lot about how to live our lives and how to move forward towards the future. So for him, the past was a very important lesson to kind of continually draw on. That's one way of looking at the past. The attack, those people that are targeting and that are waging a war against the past are very, very different. Their orientation towards the past is to teach the past a lesson. They believe that they know much better than Aristotle or Immanuel Kant or Shakespeare about what they were doing. And they actually believe that their job is to fix the problems of the past. That somehow, by criticizing the past, by targeting individuals, we can help them out. And they actually believe that they know better about what these people were in the past than the people themselves. Let me give you an example. It's very common these days, for example, to take a philosopher like Immanuel Kant. I don't know how much you studied philosophy, but he's a really important figure in the Western philosophical tradition. And they take Immanuel Kant, and they basically say Immanuel Kant had a problem because he too was a big believer in white supremacy, and no doubt deserves to be condemned for his racism, all the way forgetting the fact that his theory, his ethics, provides a very good, probably the most important arguments against inequality or racism that existed at that time. But what they then do is they basically say that actually, if I rewrite Kant's ethics and add a few sentences here and take a few sentences out, Kant would be more comprehensible to us. So basically what they're saying is they know better than Kant what he really meant, what he was really saying there. So they're teaching Immanuel Kant a lesson as if they were their peers. And they do this all the time. I think my most ridiculous example that I came up with last week, you probably saw in the newspaper that Geoffrey Chaucer, not a football player, he was a famous literary figure in the English canon. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tale required a warning. And the warning that they wanted to put on it was that it expressed Christian values. Now, I don't know how many of you read the Canterbury Tale, but it's a story of Christian pilgrims making their way toward Canterbury. So the idea that somehow these Christian pilgrims making their way to the head of the Church of England in Canterbury wouldn't be expressing Christian values is weird. Right? I mean, that's what the book is really all about. And yet, they feel the need to correct Geoffrey Chaucer and to explain that somehow there was something illegitimate about Canterbury Tales because it offends our present-day sensibilities. They take Shakespearean plays and correct Shakespearean plays. For example, they take some of his plays and they change the language. And the way they change the language is by making the words more, make the words racist. I mean, really horrible racist terms are used. And the way they justify making Shakespeare's language racist is by saying that they're making explicit the implicit assumptions that Shakespeare refused to make. In other words, they know better than Shakespeare what was really going on in his mind as far as race is concerned. So basically what they're doing is they're not learning from the past, they're continually teaching the past a lesson. They're basically saying that people that lived before us didn't just know less than we did, which is true. They knew less than we did. They were morally inferior to us. That's the important argument. So these people were essentially bad people. They were morally inferior, to our existence. So that's really what's happening. And for me, this is important for many, many reasons. But I'll just give you a couple of reasons and end on that. The first reason why the war against the past is so consequential is because it works towards disinheriting the younger generations from their legacy, from their historical legacy. Young people growing up need to have some kind of organic connections to the generations that preceded them. They need to know where they've come from. They need to have a system of meaning, which the past usually provides you with, in order for them to have a sense of clear identity, or at least be in a position to have the resources with which they overcome their identity crisis. If we dispossess them of their past, if you basically say that you're starting from scratch, you're beginning to start from nowhere, then what we're doing in effect is undermining their capacity to develop a clear sense of identity, to begin to develop a real clear sense of who they are and where they're going. Because we know very, very clearly from human history that if you don't know where you come from, if you have no idea where you come from, it's very difficult to know where you're going to end up or in which direction you should be going. And we also know, as a result of that, that if you don't know where you come from, then your whole life becomes disoriented and your sense of meaning will be compromised. So that's the first important reason. There are 8 other important reasons, but I'm going to mention one more before I shut up. The past provides us with the intellectual and moral resources through which we endow our experience with meaning. If you can imagine the way we live, we all grew up with a kind of web of meaning that is based upon what has preceded us. The meaning we attach to our experience is not something that we can simply invent, that we can just simply make up. That sense of meaning comes from our understanding of what previous generations have achieved. It's always been like that. It will always be like that in the future. If that sense of meaning becomes feeble or compromised, then our capacity to make our way in the world becomes very much threatened. And I think many of the problems that we have with identity politics, many of the problems that we have in achieving real solidarity and real community with one another is very much based upon that. When I read a long, long, long time ago Orwell, and when Orwell said that the person that controls the past controls the future, I just said, oh, that's interesting. I made a note of that. But I never imagined that in my own lifetime, what Orwell was talking about, the way in which our future is actually being attacked by the way that we're being deprived of our past, would have a very real resonance in our world. And that's why I say that we need to wake up a little bit and realize that one of the most consequential intellectual and cultural battles that is taking place is about who is going to control the past. And it's something that our future as a human society will ultimately depend on. So I'd like you to, if you get a chance to read the book, think about it, criticize it, and hopefully, by the time you read it, you'll realize that our past is not a boring subject, but is something that has become a life and death matter. Thank you.
Emma, your thoughts?
So can I just start by saying how unbelievably excited I am to be here talking about Frank's book? Because if there is one thing that you take away from what I say today, that it is how important this is, not just this book, but this area of research. And as Frank has said, he's sort of traipsing into new territory by making explicit something that is implicit, I think, in so much more than just, the issue of history. It's about everything that we're seeing, everything that we've discussed this weekend. And I'm hoping that in my brief remarks now, I'll be able to sort of elucidate what I mean by that and why I think this actually shines a light on absolutely everything. So Frank mentioned Cicero there, and Cicero had an understanding of history very different to our own today, because we have this endless present that Frank talks about in his book. That's a sort of phrase from Orwell's 1984, and he talks about the endless present in which the party is always right. And it's this kind of Procrustean bed that disfigures the past in the shape of the present. And Cicero had a very different understanding of history. He understood history in terms of precedent. The history, as many of the ancients, including here in Britain until not that long ago, viewed history as something to learn from, something to be transmitted on to future generations, something that we lived in rather than being, as Fukuyama famously said, at the end of history. So it's not just a Cold War thing. This is something that has deep roots, and the phenomenon that Frank discusses in his book has lots of poisonous tributaries running into it that it's far too complex to go into all of it. So I just want to focus on one aspect of it, and that is rationalism, because I think that's where I can maybe add to some of the insights in Frank's book. And when I say rationalism, I don't mean being rational. I mean rationalism as an ideology, the idea that everything can be derived from first principles, because fundamentally what this is a crisis of authority. The past has ceased to have its authority, and I think that the thing that introduced the bug into the machine, as it were, is the rise of rationalism as an ideology. It destroyed the authority of precedent, and legitimacy came to mean, it came to be derived only from consent, and as I say, from first principles. And part of the title of this panel is not just the war against the past, but also about the future. So I'm hoping that perhaps I can suggest some ways that maybe we can re-enter history and do something to reverse this curse that we've put on ourselves. So what Frank describes in his book has been described also by Roger Scruton as oikophobia, or the culture of repudiation. This oikophobia comes from oikos, the opposite of it being oikophilia, oikos meaning home. So oikos doesn't just mean home in the abstract, it means sense of relations, attachments, and rationalism dissolves all of those things, like I say, because it's all about first principles. It can't make sense of the relations between human beings in the present or over time. I think that's also why you see an attack on language. Frank goes into that in great depth in his book, on language, relational language, so the language of motherhood, of husband and wife, mother and children, even in some weird, twisted way, owners of pets being referred to as, I think it's caretakers. So I think that we actually have some strong traditions in this country that can help us resist this rationalist infestation in our thinking that has led us to this sort of prison of the endless present. The first is that we have a robust philosophical tradition that rejects rationalism. It's absolutely overflowing with rich resources, people like Burke, Oakeshott, Roger Scruton, David Jones, people that Frank mentions in his book in more detail. But in addition to that, we also have here in the UK a strong historic tradition as well that makes us somewhat naturally resistant to that kind of rationalist mindset. And it's in our constitution, it's in our common law institutions like the monarchy. I know there are lots of Republicans here today, so please don't heckle me. The established church. We have this idea in common law thinking of the authority of ancient precedent. But the question is, when we have a situation now where you have the Labour Party making attacks on our constitution even more, trying to shape our constitution even more into an endless present. We saw it with Tony Blair. That was one big rationalist project to try and bring our constitution and our institutional ecosystem in line with rationalist principles. And we're seeing it now with Labour pushing through this legislation that is advanced this week, actually, to get rid of the hereditary principle in the House of Lords, which is something that ties generations together. It's this Burkean, thank you, this Burkean contract between the unborn, the living, and the dead, in contrast to the social contract of the rationalists that imagines the human being outside of time, as Michael Sandel said, imagining people that do not exist and never can exist. I'm running out of time because I've got far too much to say. So I just want to zero in on one particular aspect of this, because Frank goes into this in great depth in his book, and I think it's a very fruitful line of discussion for us, which is the importance of education. Obviously, that's something that is important in transmitting the authority of the past. And Oakeshott had a lot to say, actually, about education in the context of rationalism, because the rationalist education scrubs the mind clean. I'll read you a quote. He said, "Each generation, indeed each administration, should see unrolled before it a blank sheet of infinite possibility. And if by chance this tabula rasa has been defaced by the irrational scribblings of tradition-ridden ancestors, then the first task of the rationalist must be to scrub it clean." So his point was that the educational system that we have today, the rationalist education system, it doesn't educate. It trains minds to be these neutral instruments. And as he put it, people who have been educated in this way, their minds have no atmosphere. He described this as resulting in a deep distrust of time, an impatient hunger for eternity, and an irritable nervousness in the face of everything topical or transitory. And it's something that Frank refers to in his book as the frenetic standstill, which is a term used by another sociologist. So I'll leave it there because I know there's a lot that we can go into. But I think in the deepest way possible, the one thing I want to hammer home is how important this is, because it really does touch on everything that we've been discussing this weekend. This crisis of authority that has resulted from the bug introduced into the machine, into the algorithm, as it were, of our society by rationalism. And Frank has started to excavate some of these problems in his book, and I really encourage you all to go and buy a copy if you haven't already.
Okay, thank you, Ella. James, your thoughts?
Thank you, Ella. Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Emma. I just want to begin by giving a teasing compliment to Frank and just note how delighted I am to see witness his ongoing evolution into becoming one of the great conservative commentators of our time. It's been a long ideological journey, but I, for one, am thrilled to see him accelerating to that destination. And I agree with Emma. I think this is it's impossible to overstate the importance of this book. All of us in this hall will be familiar with the history wars. They've been raging for quite a few years now. I mean, I think at least a decade. And there have been some wonderful historians called into the trenches. In fact, just a quick shout out to the wonderful organization History Reclaimed, the website there that they provide. There's a sort of, Robert Toombs has created this rapid response unit. And so every time there's a kind of flare up, whether it's Chaucer or Colston or whatever it might be, there's a 1,000-word essay comes forward. It comes forth in the Daily Telegraph or somewhere else the following day. But I think that what's been missing in the last 10 years is the kind of deep diagnosis of this cultural pathology which Frank has spotted and remedied by producing this book. I think it's so easy to get caught up in these sort of catfights over particular historical issues, particular statues, particular texts, and so on and so forth. And I think that it's a mistake to get sucked in too quickly there. I think we've got to ask what's underlying, what's driving this war on the past. And I call it, for want of a better word, and sort of in deference to the linguistic habits of our progressive age, nostophobia. Nostophobia, the opposite of nostalgia, and progressives have got nostophobia, conservatives tend towards a kind of nostalgia. And maybe both are partly in error, both perhaps have a slightly distorted picture of the past. The conservative tends to imagine the past through more rose-tinted spectacles than he ought to, and conversely, the progressive just has this monochrome loathing for all that has gone before. It's a kind of theology. It's a sort of secular, progressive theology of providence. The idea that the mere passage of time brings with it moral improvement. It's a very peculiar modern malady. We see this chronological snobbery everywhere. I recall just a few years ago, I think it was around about, about 5-6 years ago, Justin Trudeau being asked at a press conference why he thought it was necessary to insist on exact 50-50 gender parity in his new cabinet. And his response was, because it's 2017. And that was it. And that satisfied the journalist. It was enough in that progressive press conference to say, because it's 2017. The mere passage of time must bring with it the change, the moral change that the progressive wants. Now, the question, and it's an interesting question as to whether this is just, it is a bug, or whether it's in fact a feature of liberalism, whether it's a feature of modernity. And I think maybe Frank could have gone a bit deeper into this question. He touches on it at various points. For example, when he notes the origins of the word modern. So Shakespeare uses the word modern to mean something like commonplace. But modernus in Latin simply means now, or simply means the present. And it is a striking feature of our age that we're really the first chapter in human history to define ourselves by reference to time. We are the era of modernity, we are the era of now. And the trouble with identifying an age by reference to the present is that the present has an irritating habit of not remaining the present for very long, of turning into the past. And so any age that has sort of dropped its moorings just in the now is effectively going to accelerate towards a presentism through which it can't make any sense of itself and its position within the great unfolding of human history. And I notice this, and I tell my students in Cambridge this a lot. I was telling them this in a lecture only this week, it really is baked into not just this progressive theology, but into how all of us, I think, in this room have a tendency to think about the past. We were discussing in a lecture this week the Enlightenment. Now, think how freighted that term, enlightenment, is. What comes before enlightenment? What came before 1650 or so? Darkness, death, confusion and delay. The Middle Ages. Between what? The Renaissance. What comes before Renaissance? Death. The Dark Ages. That produced people like Anselm and Augustine and Aquinas and William of Ockham and Duns Scotus and so on and so forth. And so what we need to, it may be that this malady runs a lot deeper than the sort of chattering wokerati. It may be that we need to think very hard about the assumptions that we bring to understanding these questions. Just a couple of points to end on. Frank noted that the importance of teaching good history and that it socializes, socializes the young, it socializes future generations, it integrates them into this common, ongoing Burkean partnership between the dead, the living, and the yet to be born. But I think that's precisely the point. The energy of the attack on the past is precisely that it deracinates, it atomizes, it makes it impossible for our young to forge the kind of loyalty to nation, to civilization that is absolutely essential. And that is a part of what the progressive movement is seeking to do. It's seeking, in fact, to create a global intifada, a global community that is peopled by foot soldiers who will repudiate, insist on repudiating their loyalty to their own oikophobia, as Emma referred to it. So down with nostophobia and down with oikophobia. And this is one of the best manifestos for that clarion call that I've come across.